be speaking to us on her MA Cities thesis, Generous Waste.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We have an amazing audience here today. So I think I'll just speak about the experience and the process because I've been speaking a lot about the kind of theory behind it. So Generous Waste started as a theoretical exploration of how we could explore what a metamorphosis or transition or transformation of a society could look like through very hands-on creative applications such as paper making, etc. Just using it as a tactile entry point to how we might begin to reimagine the city, but trying to do that from a very different perspective rather than simply sitting down and having a conference or a chat. Let's actually make something and have these conversations grounded within an activity and a collective exploration. And then very quickly, it kind of evolved into a conversation that we would have on the hyperlocal scale, or particularly what I now call the neighborhood scale, where we're actually getting people together and speaking to them as streets, as a constituency or a neighborhood, however they come together, and then kind of proposing to them that we could start with maybe paper making as an entry point to this conversation, because it's a very simple, accessible kind of waste material that everybody generates. And so you can see, like, we started mapping what that transition or that transformation could look like, what that metamorphosis could look like, and then using that to ground those deeper conversations around scale. So we would start on the neighborhood scale, but then we would think about what that meant on the global scale. What does that mean when we start to take our supply chains, thinking about our supply chains, or even our ecological chains, such as the loss of biodiversity to keep our paper use supplied through kind of monocrops, etc. So we kind of started those types of conversations, and then we would breathe out into the neighborhood and think, what does this mean if we then decide to collect our waste together, explore it as something incredibly abundant and something very generous, and start thinking about how we can continue this cycle of reusing it, but grounded within that conversation of the type of effect that our consumption has on that global scale. So it just offered multiple ways of exploring this, this type of, okay, how can we change our world and how can we transform our imagination? And then when I kind of started the workshops, I was wondering, are we going deep enough? Is this going to serve that exploration justice? But then I kind of just started and kept going, and then the conversations got richer and richer, and then you would see this kind of wonder on people's faces whenever they made a sheet of paper, and they were like, wow, this is actually really possible. We could do this. It's such a simple process. And so then that also offered another end. That showed that it's really possible to kind of explore this thing of sociogenesis that through such a simple kind of type of workshop. So we started off with a neighbor kind of saying to me, do you think you could use these paper cups to make paper as a joke, because I've been making paper that day? And I said, well, yeah, I think I could. I'm going to take it and have a go. And they were like, well, you're totally nuts. So I thought, right, that's fine. We're going to actually try this. Took it home, and I came back the next week with 50 sheets of paper. And then that spiraled a whole new kind of interrogation within the neighborhood. People then thinking, okay, well, maybe we should keep our compost. Actually, maybe we should do this. Actually, what does this mean for the fact that we're using all of these cups? Maybe we should bring our own, cups rather than constantly generating waste, etc. Yeah, so it just showed that there was a lot of scope for the conversation on that scale. So I kind of chose this picture at the Barbican because I was part of the Earth Quest trail there. And it was just, we also did some ink making where we made ink out of vegetable matter, and the colors were so incredibly vibrant that it just showed that you just have to have very simple interventions where people can see that something is possible for them to begin thinking about it on that larger kind of even global scale. And then I think the next step for me was, we don't want this thing to just live in the realm of, okay, this is a lovely artistic pursuit, we'll make some beautiful artwork and put it on the wall, which is very viable. But if we're going to be talking about this on the hyper-local scale, it needs to be really practical. People need to see it and think that, okay, this is actually doable, possible, and I can implement it into my daily life, and then that's where you situate that bigger conversation about the effects of our consumption. So then it was, can we print on this paper? And that was quite possible. I've printed on it using my home printer. My friends have printed on it. It's quite possible. We've made the paper out of the cups and then turned it into booklets and zines, posters. You'll see some posters in my exhibition, etc. there. So that was the thing. Because then people started saying, well, yeah, this is lovely, but what can we do with it? And now I say, well, here we are. Let's do this. And now we're actually printing our newsletter at my workplace on paper that we've made from our own waste. So, you know, that's proof in itself. It's possible, and we can transform things on that larger scale. It really makes it more, they can conceive there's a possibility of us moving forward and creating that great transition that we need to create. I think one of the key things is that, for me, it was, okay, we're going to get together, we're going to make this thing, and then people started seeing it almost as this magical process. They were like, and it kind of blew my mind, because we've been so far removed from our, going back to supply chains, the ways that things are created because of the way that we live now, that when we engage in a very simple act of making a sheet of paper or doing some other kind of creative pursuit that's very simple, it blows people's minds away and they think it's magic, when actually it's probably more magical the fact that there are massive monocrops of one type of tree, and these massive factories where they're making these things, using a lot of energy. Maybe that's more magical than this very simple process. I thought that was incredible. And then there's something to say about when you bring those conversations into the scale of the domestic, when you want to create that kind of grassroots kind of transformation of the imagination, you have to bring it into the realms of what people can use and what they can see. But then, of course, that depends on the way you're approaching it. And my approach is very much hyper-local and then permeating out to the global. So, of course, this lends itself beautifully to collaboration. So one of my cohort members, Sadia, who's lost her voice and is a bit sick today, but she's here holding the day together. She explores unhearing the way that we normally listen to the city, and to begin listening to the city from the lens especially of the non-human, and adding more perspective to how we engage and actually just perceive what the city is. And so one of the things that Sadia would do is invite people to submit recordings, and then to transcribe those recordings. So if you hear a bird song, what do you think that bird is saying? And it just adds these really multi-layered, really beautiful kind of approaches to even conceiving of the city. And we collaborated on this workshop, which was a memory workshop, with a group of Bengali women at Calthorpe Community Gardens. And we were thinking about how to approach this thing of memory. And we thought, well, spices, because I think that for me, they evoke an incredible memory of like my grandparents, my mother cooking in the kitchen particular dishes, and then you think about the day. So that's what we did. So made paper out of the coffee cups, and that brought one particular type of conversation. And then we put spices in it so that it had this really incredible smell. And the idea was that we would collect single words from people that, in terms of the smell that it evoked. It didn't quite go like that. Instead, we ended up talking about memories. I think it just ended up being a much more verbal exploration, which was itself really incredible. So then that also showed me that something as simple as this intervention that allows you to speak to these larger scales of how our supply chains and how we even think of the city, we can actually extract something and then extract that activity and then use it in these other really incredible ways to further kind of participate with people in different ways, which was really quite special in that sense. And then Sadia also placed it on top of this blanket, which is recycled from saris. I don't know, I can't remember the name for it, but you recycle the saris, you stitch them together, and then you turn it into a blanket. And so then they were quite fascinated by that conversation around the coffee cups becoming paper and then it being laid on top of this recycled thing. And they said, well, it's nothing new for us. We do that all the time. So it's really good that you guys are learning. And then I think then that kind of led to us starting. That's when we came up with the name of City Collectives when we were in Bilbao. We went to Bilbao to run a workshop with some students at Kunsthal at the Design University in Bilbao and showed them the process of paper making, but also before that spoke to them about that theoretical approach to it as a way of it opening a door towards a new urban imaginary and it offering a type of, I don't know, a hand language, a tactile language to beginning this type of exploration. And this is what the students kind of came up with. Some of them decided to turn it into collage, which I never thought of. We even had a student that went away and made a 3D mold for seed bombs. And the conversations that we had with them were really fascinating. I think the student that did the seed bombs, he said that I wouldn't normally see paper as a material that I would want to work with as a design student because it's not durable. However, after joining your class, I've realized that it's not simply about what the material can do, it's about the type of conversations that we can generate around the material. And so I'm going to actually take a step back and rethink the way that I see material in that conversation, and maybe even thinking about where my materials are coming from and what it means on the global scale when I'm using a particular material. And so that was quite incredible because I think at first he was like, oh, paper making, okay, this is interesting. But then as that theoretical approach unfolded, he himself found he had a metamorphosis of his own positionality, which I thought was quite incredible. And that is the key purpose of what this project is. And I think the last thing I want to speak to is that it got really boring. I ran so many workshops. I probably ran 20 workshops last year in a very short space of time. I was popping up in the neighborhood I work in. I was running them. I ran many of them here, right in the crossing. I ran them in there. It just got to the point where it's like, I can't make any more paper. But I didn't want to show that because I wanted to see what unfolded. And then eventually, a neighbor in the community I work in Birmingham came up to me and said, this is pretty boring now. Can we make something different? And I was like, well, you know what? This is a process. I don't own it. I want you to own the process. So what do you want to do? So he went away and he came back and he said, well, I'd like to make some briquettes. Maybe we could have a community barbecue. And maybe around that community barbecue, we can think about the types of conversations that we want to have for people to start thinking how we can change our neighborhood. So I said, okay. And so we started making briquettes out of the cups and the plates from the local lunch, from the community lunch that we ran. We haven't had the barbecue yet. But what's ended up happening from that is boaters, because we have the canals, they've been asking for the briquettes and putting them in their fireplaces. So it's just been interesting to see where the conversation goes and not being too precious about it arriving at that final destination, allowing it to almost unfold, and also not being too doctrinal about the approach. I mean, often people talk about the use of electricity, such as blenders. But then, of course, there's a reality of human energy if we decide we're not going to blend it, etc., and all of these types of conversations. So it's just been really amazing to see how it's unfolded and where it's gone, and embracing that process of that boredom and seeing that it's going somewhere. Eventually, people will own that process. And then, as a kind of a conclusion to that, when I took a kind of 3 months sabbatical from the neighborhood and went back and found that many of those theoretical explorations that we were having in a coded language around these activities have now surfaced very overtly. People are saying, well, wow, I mean, now I understand this, and now can we try this because of this? And they're actually speaking to those larger explorations that I was trying to kind of ground within that creative framework. So we kind of got there in the end, but not in a way where I was saying this and that. We got there in a way that allowed people to reflect, act, make change in very small ways that comes together in that larger transition, transformation, or metamorphosis. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, do we have any questions? I think we do have a second mic if there are any questions.
Yes, I'm happy to pass the mic if anyone has a question about Khadijah's work.
Hi. I'd be interested to know what of the sort of potential future interventions they were thinking or discussing about making when you went back off their own back.
So I think the first conversation we had was, can we have a collection point because I work on a new development, and so my office is actually on a barge. So they were like, can we have a collection point next to the barge where we bring all our paper and then maybe start making paper once a week? And then can we start thinking about how that happens? And it just kind of so happens that we were thinking about this exact same thing, but now we're thinking about doing it in a way that connects with our neighborhood kind of science work, where we will start measuring it and using it as a way of collecting data, etc. So that's kind of where it's fed into, and that's where it's hopefully heading, and we'll start that in July. And then I think the other thing that it led to were people saying, well, if we have the shredded paper, can we then think about, are there other types of activities we can do? So can we just actually shred it down and have it there and then we start using it? But of course, there are real life conversations. Where are we going to store it? How are we going to store it? Those are now things I'm having to really think really quickly, because if we don't get it going, we will lose the moment. So yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Hello. First of all, I thought that was I was riveted by that. I thought that was absolutely incredible. A thing I noticed was you described a situation in which the durability of the material had been important to the student with the seed bombs, and they'd gotten over that. And you described the replication of process and training people as being your initial expectation, but perhaps like the vanilla duplication of something becomes wearing. And what was more interesting to you was like a natural evolution of this process and this product. I'll be careful how I phrase this, where like the organic unfolding of something, this metamorphosis is inherent to the thing that you're creating, and actually the thing that gives it power. How do you engage smaller communities, businesses, in such a way that the untrustworthiness of process is actually part of it? Like there's a little bit of faith that goes into this. It grows in its own right. You're this voice setting the vision. But like you said, these people are interpreting it in their own way. How do you sell that uncertainty to people?
That is a really good question. So very early on in this exploration, a coffee shop did approach me about how we could take this process forward, but they said I had to standardize the process. And I said, well, unfortunately, at this point of exploration, I'm not standardizing the process because the exploration is not specifically for you. It's for the community I'm working with. But I think this is the next stage, inevitably, that I have to begin exploring. So currently, we're looking at when I was speaking earlier on about that, connecting it in with that activity of data collection on that, co-creating our data sets, etc. The next step from that is to use that data to begin imagining what a potential microfactory could look like and what that could mean for the neighborhood. And I think when we get to the stage of a microfactory of some sort, that's when we can begin engaging businesses, because then we have data sets, nice shiny data sets that they can see and potentially see a possibility and a way forward in. I'm not entirely sure how that will work, but I'm feeling that might be where we have to go. But right now, I think it's definitely within the realms of the transforming imagination. I want to keep it there until we can step into there with that embedded fully and truly within the process. but still, I don't know.
Yeah, so the intent stays really important and really solid. You're giving people something they can hook into, something that is standardized in such a way that still is conversant with the project, but you are not then limiting yourselves to only that, like means of production sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Just definitely don't.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Diana, did you have a further question?
I heard you say something I'd not heard you say before, which was the words depth to the scale, which I really liked. And it reminded me of how many different diagrammatic or spatial scale jumps, or thinking about space in relation to systems, the invisible in relation to the material, the global in relation to agency in the block, you've dealt with. And I wondered if you wanted to reflect about spatial language in your work alongside myth, just because I really enjoyed the image in my head of depth to the scale as a description of your work.
I think that's definitely very often the depth of the scale has definitely been a response to Diana, our course leaders. Constant question about what scale are you talking about, and how do you explore the in between, how you chop between scales. And I have kind of come to the conclusion that it's really difficult for me in this project to directly, explicitly say what scale I'm speaking about, because in every single conversation I tend to speak about the hyperlocal, and then I'll foreground that, or I'll speak about, then I'll connect it to the global, but then also connect that to the ecological context of the global, but also the social context of the global. And then we tend to talk about it in the context of the national. So what could this mean in England? So if we kind of collect that data and we start exploring this, what could this mean when we start scaling it up to the city, out of a neighborhood in Birmingham to the city, and then what does that mean when we scale it up to the nation? So I think that's kind of where I've started thinking about it as depth of scale, because this is a conversation that allows us to engage with many different scales at the same time, in ways that it doesn't have to be completely explicit, and it doesn't have to feel as if it's excluding people from that conversation because of the complexity of it. Just through the act of doing it, we engage with that depth of scale. So that's how I would reflect and respond to that.
Is that language in use in the neighborhood?
It really depends on who I'm speaking to. It really depends on who I'm speaking to. People that have been engaging with the project for a while, yes, we do speak about depth of scale and intersecting scales, etc. So we do speak about that.
Of course.
I'm so fascinated by this, I swear, honestly. So I love that you are taking back some of these words. I'm still stuck on the word like durability, because when we talk about global projects now, so often we mean digital projects, connecting us in shallow, momentarily interesting ways, like a trend, a global trend in the West, something like that. And what I'm hearing you say is actually the local is global. Because if we are able to become embedded in our neighborhoods, in our communities, that's what makes us global. We're talking about a project here that is so dependent on the tactile, the real, in a way that I almost find like a little bit rebellious, in a really good sense. We're so used to having our products blindly delivered to us, shipped to us. I've never thought this deeply about paper, ever. Something so simple like this, so simple, and yet it takes so much effort. The people who sit there and like program these machines, who run like the IoT, the people who design these things and mass produce them, have become really invisible to us. And to make us notice those people, and also to become those people, I think that's part of the depth you're describing. I find, this is not a question, I just find that really fascinating. I find that really interesting.
was less of a question, more of a thought that was triggered, and also building on the point that's just made. So I'm a researcher, and I interviewed a company who make tissue paper a couple of years ago, and I asked them what kind of challenges they face when they're selling tissue online. Apparently it's a really hard product for people to choose because it's really hard to know like how absorbent it is and like how big it is as well. Just buying paper online is not easy. So I think that again there's a tension between the analog and the digital there when it comes to paper, which is quite interesting.
You've spiraled a whole new set of thoughts for me that I have to kind of definitely think of. Yeah. It just makes me think of in halfway through the project, I made an audio play from the perspective of a cup. So a paper cup telling its own story of how it then went on to become a sheet of paper and an eco brick. And because there at that point I started thinking, okay, what would the cup say to me if it could tell its story? But I hadn't really thought about what the person behind the production, the mass production of paper, what they might say if they could tell their story. So I was thinking about it from the object, but then that is a really fascinating exploration that could generate some interesting, I don't know, imagine you make paper at a factory.
I shouldn't just yell, sorry. You're anthropomorphizing something to create empathy. The narrative tells us something at a micro level that informs the macro of the project, right? One of the other things we have empathy with very instinctively is other people, right? So I think if you're turning an object into a person to get more connected, that is a very important thing to do. But there are kind of secret stories behind the object. In the same way there are women who've worn those saris that you sewed together who all have a story, right? In that quilt, in that tapestry. Yeah. Again, this is not a question, I'm just absolutely fascinated.
Do we have any further questions or comments? Thank you very much, Khadijah. Let's give her a hand.